So yesterday I told you that today we'll deal with the topic of nullum tempus occurrit regiae, that is lapse of time does not bar the right of the crown. Usually what happens is that under criminal law a limitation period ought not to be there, but from 1973 a legislative experiment has been done with the intention that if this experiment succeeds, we can incorporate newer offences under the limitation chapter of CRPC, that is from 467 to section 473. So generally the principle of criminal law is that the lapse of time does not bar right of the crown. Another principle which deals with the same topic is that that crime never pays. Right? If a person commits robbery, then in those situations he cannot get the benefit of limitation, that if you are unable to catch a robber for a period of, let us suppose, 3 years or 4 years, then he can suddenly appear and says, now 3 years have expired and now you cannot punish me. Now that is not the norm of the law. The law is primarily that lapse of time will not bar the right of the crown to pursue the offender. But let me tell you about the legislative experiment that has been done. It has been incorporated in the limitation chapter under section 467 to 473. Primarily we come to the section of 468, which bars the taking of cognizance after a specified period of time. Let us suppose the offence is punishable with fine and fine only. Then what is the period of limitation after which a bar will apply? 6 months. Alright. Let us suppose if the offence is punishable by maximum to maximum by 1 year. Then again the bar of limitation will apply after the expiry of that 1 year period. So if let us suppose there is any offence under IPC that is punishable up to 1 year, and if during that 1 year no complaint has been given, then the limitation period will apply and the courts will be barred from taking cognizance of that particular offence. Now the maximum period of limitation that has been given under CRPC is regarding the offence which are punishable up to 3 years. Alright, up to 3 years. It shouldn't exceed 3 years. The moment it exceeds even a day more than 3 years, the entire limitation chapter of CRPC will not apply. Alright, and for that the period is, you guessed it right, 3 years. If the offence is punishable by maximum of 3 years, let us suppose theft simpliciter is punishable maximum by 3 years, and if for 3 years that a particular individual has not been prosecuted, then in those situations the limitation period will apply and there will be a bar to taking cognizance after a lapse of that period. I am just giving an illustration. These are not ironclad rules also, because under section 473 you will see that even regardless of these limitation provisions, the magistrate in its power can condone the limitation period. Then how will you compute this limitation period? So generally it is to be computed from the date of offence. And if let us suppose you do not know the date of the offence, then what will you do? If the commission of offence is not known, that who committed that particular offence, and the person aggrieved or the police officer does not know that who is the particular offender, then the later day, the day on which he comes to know about that person who they suspect has committed the offence, then the limitation shall be counted from that. Alright. And the third situation that arises is that where the offence is not known by the person aggrieved itself. If let us suppose a person has committed a theft from somebody's house, now the owner of the property doesn't know that a theft has been committed within his house, then the limitation period will start from the day when this particular owner comes to know that an offense has been committed regarding that property, that a theft has been committed within his house. So from that day, your limitation period of 3 years will be counted. Alright. So this is how you will count it. So there are 3 situations under 469. One, from the date of offense. Second, from if the commission of offense was not known to the person or the police officer. Then from the date of knowledge, when you come to know of the offense. And third is when the identity of the offender is not known. Then from the day you come to know about the identity of the offender. Alright. And also, while computing the period of limitation, the day which is counted, which is from it is counted, is excluded. Alright. This is a similar pattern that you see under the Limitation Act 1963 as well. Now we come to section 470. It excludes the period of limitation in certain cases. To simplify it, a period of limitation shall be excluded when a person is prosecuting with due diligence another prosecution, and he comes to know that due to defect of a jurisdiction or other cause of like nature, the court where he was prosecuting that particular offense is unable to entertain that prosecution. Alright, let us suppose the court is not empowered to deal with those prosecution cases. Let us suppose a special court has been created for those particular offenses, yet the person who is prosecuting the case is prosecuting it within a court simpliciter, like that of your session judge, additional session judge, not the special court. In those situations, the period for limitation can be excluded. Alright, provided it is satisfied that person was prosecuting with due diligence, be it appeal or revision or a trial, and second, that the court cannot entertain that particular prosecution because of its defect in jurisdiction or other cause of like nature. Whenever the legislature adds other cause of like nature, you construe it as ejusdem generis. Like the causes will be very similar to defect of jurisdiction, not otherwise. Alright. So be very clear that the requirements of section 470 subsection 1 are that exclusion of time can be given if the person has been prosecuting with due diligence another prosecution, either in a trial court or in a court of appeal or revision. And second condition that should exist is regarding the court itself, that the court is unable to entertain the prosecution due to defect of jurisdiction or other causes of like nature. Now second part we come to is, let us suppose a superior court has stayed by injunction or order the particular prosecution. Then during the period of stay, you guessed it right, the time will be excluded. That will not be used for counting the limitation period. Let us suppose stay is in operation for 3 years, and then after 3 years the stay is vacated. Now the person who is being prosecuted for theft says, now see, the stay was in operation for 3 years and limitation period for prosecuting the offense of theft or any offense which is punishable for a period not exceeding 3 years is 3 years. So in those situations, the person who is taking such kind of an objection, which will be the accused in this case, will not succeed, because section 468 will be read with what? Section 470 in this situation. Because there was a stay, then the period of stay will not be counted. Similarly, where there is a want of sanction, let us suppose you are prosecuting a public servant. Now you come to know there is a bar for cognizance unless you take appropriate sanction from the state government or central government, as the case may be. Now what may happen is that the government will take, let us suppose, 1 or 2 years or 3 years or even 6 years. So again, similarly in this case also, the period of limitation regarding that person will also be excluded. Alright. Now we come to next situation. If let us suppose the person has absconded, is absent from India or any territory which is under the administration of central government, or is avoiding arrest by absconding or concealing himself, then in those situations also the limitation period, the time for limitation period will not be counted. Always remember, there is always a difference between period of limitation and computation of period of limitation. How the limitation period will be calculated will be determined in accordance with 469, 470, 471, 472 and 473. But what is the limitation period? What are the limitation periods? That has to be counted by the virtue of section 468. That is, if it is fine only, then 6 months, etc., etc. Now keep one more difference in mind, that calculation of limitation period and period of limitation, or computation of limitation period or period of limitation, are two different things. They are not the same. This if you keep this difference in mind, it will help you a lot when I'll teach you Limitation Act 1963, because most people are often confused in the period of limitation and how the period of limitation is to be counted. So the period of limitation for the purpose of CRPC is given under 468. Alright, period of limitation. But how and from what date it is to be counted is given in the sections following section 468. Alright. So if the identity of the offender is not known, or offense is not known to have been committed, alright. So in those situations, from the day when it gets to know that a particular person has committed the offense, or the particular date where the person aggrieved knows that the offense has been committed against him, then section 469 shall apply. And if, let us suppose, with due diligence a person was prosecuting a case in wrong court, then section 460 subsection 1 will apply. If let us suppose it was stayed, then section 470 subsection 2 will apply. If, let us suppose, a certain time is required for getting previous consent or sanction of the appropriate government, then section 473 will be required. And in those situations, what will happen? The period which has been used by the appropriate government to accord sanction, let us suppose the government takes 6 years to grant sanction, then in those situations also, this entirety of 6 years will not be counted for the purpose of limitation period. Alright. So as long as the government takes to grant sanction, the period of limitation will also remain suspended. And the moment the sanction is granted, after excluding 1 day, you have again the period of limitation running. Alright. So to simplify it, you can also call section 470 that when will the period of limitation will be suspended. Alright. Or will not be counted. Whatever suits your terminology. Now we come to section 471. It incorporates a doctrine, lex not, that a law does not mandate to do an impossible act. If an act is impossible, the law never says that you have to do it. It has been, it is a Latin maxim of lex non cogit ad impossibilia. So why is that maxim here? Because it is saying if the court is closed and your limitation period expires on that day, then you can also introduce the complaint or whatever mode of prosecution you are pursuing on the next day when it reopens. Let us suppose your limitation period expires on Sunday, and that is the day you opt for complaint before the court of law. Now on Sunday every court is closed, then what will you do? Are your rights to be defeated? Section 471 then comes in and cures your case and says that you can also prefer your complaint on the next date. Now we come to section 472. It talks about the continuing offences. Now continuing offences, I'll give you an example of a continuing offence, but I'll first read the section for you. In every case of continuing offences, a fresh period of limitation shall begin at every moment of time during which the offence continues. So section 498A of the IPC, that is cruelty, is an example and illustration of continuing offence. Okay. Now let us suppose a husband is continuously inflicting cruelty on his wife. Now every time that he indulges in cruelty, a fresh period of limitation shall be computed. So it is like the limitation period is forever running as long as the cruelty is continuing. So in regards with the continuing offense, a fresh period of limitation is always counted. So be very sure, as long as a husband continues cruelty on the wife, the period of limitation shall be calculated afresh. The husband cannot say that, let us suppose at the start of the year he committed cruelty, and then the conduct is such that the effect of that cruelty is continuing in nature. Then he cannot say that I am not doing cruelty, my limitation period should be calculated from the first date when I started it. The court will simply say that as long as you continue cruelty, a fresh period of 3 years will be calculated every time. Why? Because 498A is punishable up to 3 years, and section 468 subclause C says if the offence exceeds 1 year but not exceeds 3 years, then 3 years shall be limitation period. But since 498A is a continuing offence, each time the cruelty continues, a fresh period of limitation shall be counted. Alright. To put it succinctly, each occasion of cruelty is a new starting point of limitation. Each occasion of cruelty. When I'll come to 498A, I'll be telling you that is a continuing offence that has been held in Arun Vyas versus Anita Vyas. It was decided by the Supreme Court. Right now that is not essential for you to know. But all that is essential for you to know that it is continuing offence. And that is one illustration that I think should clear your concept regarding continuing offences. Now we come to section 473, and there are only two nuances in that. The section is very fairly worded, but there are two judgments on it: Rakesh Kumar Jain versus State through CBI and State of Himachal Pradesh versus Tara Dutt. I'll just simply tell you what section 473 is. Notwithstanding anything contained in the foregoing provision of this chapter, any court may take cognizance of an offence after expiry of the period of limitation. So it starts with the clause of notwithstanding. What does it mean? It is a non obstante clause. A non obstante clause overrides the other provisions of the Act. So it is saying that no matter what the limitation period has been given, if the magistrate believes that for the interest of justice it is necessary for him to take cognizance and the delay has been properly explained, then in those situations he may, notwithstanding limitation period, take cognizance of an offence. So this is why we call it a legislative experiment. This is not a cut in stone principle that cannot be violated at all, because the interest of justice are paramount for the procedural law. Now I come to your point of Rakesh Kumar Jain versus State through CBI. In this case, Supreme Court primarily said that appellate court itself can consider the matter of condonation of delay when, let us suppose, the case is pending before itself, and rather than remanding the case back to the trial court for deciding upon the issue of condonation of delay, that whether the limitation period should be condoned or not. So rather than remanding the case back to the lower court, appellate court can itself grant the certification of condonation of delay. So in this case, what happened was that the complaint was filed after 25 days since the limitation period was expired. So the court said that it will merely at the expiry of this period of 25 days will not entitle the accused to seek his discharge under 245 CRPC, because the complainant has under a law right to seek extension of time under 473 CRPC. The complainant could satisfy the magistrate on the facts and circumstances that the delay was explainable and the interest of justice, the complaint should be entertained. Now you must know that before an acquittal happens, a discharge stage is there before the stage of charge framing. A person can be let off if the prima facie offence has not been disclosed against him. So what happened was, in this case, that during the course of an argument, during the discharge hearings, the accused took an objection that the limitation period has expired, so I should be discharged. Supreme Court on this point said that no, that is not the sole ground to get discharged, because your prosecution can always prove before the magistrate that there was a reasonable cause for delay, and in the interest of justice the magistrate should take cognizance of a particular offence. In Rakesh Kumar Jain versus state represented through CBI, there was another point that was held, which you can gather after reading the entire judgment, is that the appellate court, if let us suppose the magistrate gives an order against the accused will go to appeal, will prefer an appeal, and while he is preferring the appeal, the appellate court, rather than remanding the case back to the trial court to decide whether the condonation of delay should be given or not, can itself decide the question that delay should be condoned or not. Alright. Another nuance that is there, and that this is the last nuance that is there, is that a state of Himachal Pradesh versus Tarajan. In this case, what happened? The Supreme Court said that section 473 confers power on the court for taking cognizance after expiry of the period of limitation if it is satisfied on the facts and in circumstances of the case that the delay has been properly explained and that it is necessary to do so in the interest of justice. Obviously, therefore, in respect of offences for which a period of limitation has been provided under section 468, the power has been conferred on the court taking cognizance to extend the said period of limitation where proper and satisfactory explanation of delay is available, and where the court taking cognizance finds that it would be in the interest of justice. This discretion conferred on the court has to be exercised judicially and on well-recognized principle. All judicial orders are based on reasons, remember that. Supreme Court continued, this being a discretion conferred on the court while taking cognizance, wherever the court exercises this discretion, there must be a speaking order. A speaking order means an order based on reasons. An order which is not based on reasons cannot be called a speaking order. Let us suppose the magistrate were to write only on his order granted. On what grounds has the order been granted? If that is not explained, then this is not a speaking order. If let us suppose the magistrate were to dismiss a case and just write one word in his judgment, dismissed, that is, let us suppose he were to write one word in his order that I dismiss this case, then that is not a speaking judgment or a speaking order. In those situations, unless the reasons are there, in all situations such an order or judgment will be set aside by the superior or revisional court. In all of the cases, if there is not a speaking order and the legislature requires the court to exercise its discretion judicially, then in those situations the appellate or revisional court will always set aside such a non-speaking order. Alright, so order while condoning the period of limitation under 473 must be a speaking order. That is what all you need to remember. And since it should be a speaking order, there should also be a positive order to that effect, so that a superior court before which the order is challenged can reasonably consider the grounds on which the magistrate condoned the delay. Alright, so this was it. This was only there for limitation. And now we go back to IPC, because this was related to section 2. So that is why I thought that it would be expedient for all of you to know this. Now we come to section 3 of IPC. Punishment of offences committed beyond but which by law may be tried within India. Any person liable by any Indian law to be tried for an offence committed beyond India shall be dealt with according to the provision of this code for any act committed beyond India in the same manner as if such act has been committed within India. So let us suppose you as a citizen of India were to commit an offence in a foreign jurisdiction, not within Indian jurisdiction, or were to commit the offence on high seas. you will be prosecuted under Indian law, because Indian law will continue to apply on you as long as you are a citizen of India. Alright, so that is what section 3 is saying. Let us suppose A, who is a citizen of India, commits murder in United Kingdom, and somehow he arrives safely back in India. Then in this situation, such person will be tried in accordance with the Indian law, and he will be punished and sentenced even though he did not commit the particular offence within the territory or within the territorial waters of India. Alright, so notwithstanding that you are not committing an offence under IPC, but if you were to commit an offence outside the jurisdiction of the Indian dominion, then even in those situations you will be held liable. There used to be a very good illustration regarding this, but since Joseph Schein versus Union of India, that illustration has been rendered redundant. So that is why I am not giving you that illustration. But imagine, for that illustration used to be this. Let us suppose adultery is punishable again under 497. In Joseph Schein versus Union of India, it has been struck down. But let us suppose adultery is punishable again. So let us suppose an Indian citizen goes to UK, commits adultery. He can be tried within India for committing adultery in UK by the virtue of section 3. I wanted to give you that illustration, but that illustration has been powered down by the Supreme Court's judgment in Joseph Schein versus Union of India. Regardless of that, you get an idea. If you are subject to Indian law and you were to commit an offence under IPC, under any jurisdiction of the world, be it foreign, high seas, etc., you would still be liable in India wherever you are found. For that purpose, you will read it with section 188 and 189 of the CRPC. Now we come to section 4, extension of the code to the extraterritorial offences. The provision of this code shall also apply to any offence committed by any citizen of India in any place without and beyond India. That is self-explanatory. Now we come to subsection 2. Any person on any ship or aircraft registered in India, wherever it may be. Now see, the first clause talks about any citizen. So this is talking about Indian citizen. So you know, while reading section 3 with section 4, that no matter where in the world you commit an offence that is punishable under IPC, if at all the prosecution is preferred regarding those offences in India, you will be tried and punished accordingly. So that is very easy to understand. But section 4 clause 2 says any person on any ship. Now it has changed the word. It has used the word person. Now this applies on the foreigners as well. So it applies to aliens as well. It says that if any person, let us suppose of Pakistan, UK, America, were to commit offence on any ship or aircraft registered in India, wherever that is. Let us suppose an Indian ship is on the high seas, and an Italian person or a Pakistani person who is on the ship were to commit an offence there under IPC. Let us suppose he committed theft. In those situations, if that ship were to port to India and such person who has committed the offence is apprehended and prosecuted, he cannot succeed in this defense that I am not a citizen of India and hence IPC doesn't apply to me, because section 4 will say that since you were a person who committed an offence on any ship or aircraft which was registered in India, wherever in the world it was, you will be punished. So this is why section 4 applies to extraterritorial offences. That is beyond the territory of India. You need to be very clear about this section. Now, we come to section 3. Any person in any place without and beyond India committing or targeting a computer resource located in India. Let us suppose a Chinese national were to hack your computer. Then in those situations, let us suppose he arrives in India on a tourist visa, and you through your sources comes to know that he was the same person who hacked your computer resource. Now he can be prosecuted and punished under the IT Act. Alright, right away your section 4 of the IPC. So this is specifically made to target cyber terrorism cases and cyber crimes. So it gives section 4 gives an illustration also. A who is a citizen of India commits a murder in Uganda, he can be tried and convicted of a murder in any place in India in which he may be found. Now I'll give you a different illustration. Now let us suppose there are two Americans on the high seas and their ship is not registered with India. The American were to commit a murder of another American, alright, on the high seas, where the territorial limits of India does not extend. Now, he stabbed that person and he is rigorously bleeding. The ship arrives after a while, after the offense has been committed, it arrives in the port of India. And that person who committed the offense actually takes the person or the deceased victim to a hospital in Mumbai where the ship has been ported. The doctors declare that particular person that he is brought dead on arrival, that he was dead long before. Now can such an American be tried within India? The answer is no. Neither section 4 applies, neither section 3 applies. Of course, due to reciprocal arrangements between India and United States, the Indian government can always inform the United States government that such and such incident has happened and be requesting you to take cognizance of that particular instance. But this does not belong to the dominion of India. This is not the concern of India. Alright. So, be very clear about that. That do not think that section 3 and section 4 when combined together is unlimited. So if let us suppose two Italians were to commit an offense on the high seas, not against an Indian, but later they arrived at an Indian port, can be tried for that offense which they committed on the high seas? The answer is no. Alright. So remember this example of a murder which I just gave you. I'll reiterate again. There are two Americans, A and B. During a course of altercation, A gets very angry with B. They both are on high seas. And A stabs B, due to which B is grievously injured. After a while, they come inside the Indian territorial waters. And when they arrive within the Indian territorial waters, they stop at the port of Mumbai, where A takes B to a hospital. B dies there. B dies in Mumbai, in hospital. So, can it be said that A can be prosecuted for murder of B in India? The answer is no. The offense was committed in a high seas. A question like this comes. And it has arrived in Himachal Pradesh Judicial Service. And often people commit a mistake when they think that section 3 and section 4 are unlimited in scope. They are not. Similarly, if let us suppose a foreign subject who is resident in a foreign territory, he instigates commission of an offense which is to be committed in India. Alright. A foreigner instigates an offense like Hafiz Saeed, let us suppose he instigates a terrorist in India. But let us suppose that instigation has been given, but the offense is not complete. Instigation is given, but offense is not complete. If the offense and the consequence has not taken place within India, again Indian government will not have jurisdiction. But if the consequence has happened in India due to this instigation, then the Indian government will have jurisdiction to prosecute that foreigner, if at all they succeed in extradition proceedings. So I will also explain to you the extradition proceedings in very brief, because it is necessary for you to know holistically what the position of law is. But as far as I can think, that these things should be understandable by you. And keep in mind that example that I just gave before this regarding the USA nationals. Alright, because if they were to commit an offense on the high seas, and merely because they arrived for treatment in the port of India, will not give Indian court a jurisdiction, because neither condition of section 3 is being satisfied and neither the condition of section 4 is being satisfied. Alright, so what about the extradition procedure? See, in India, the extradition procedure is governed by the Extradition Act of 1962. Every state has its own extradition act. Now, I use the state in the international law sense. By state, I mean country. In the international law sense, state means country. Alright. Do not assume it the state of UP and all that. So, extradition procedure in India is governed by Extradition Act of 1962. And there was a very beautiful judgment in state of West Bengal versus Jugal Kishore and another. It was decided on 10th of January 1969, where the Supreme Court emphasized that extradition is surrender by one state to another of a person desired to be dealt with for the crimes of which he has been accused or convicted and which are justiciable in the courts of the other state. Surrender of a person within the state to another state, whether a citizen or alien, is a political act. Alright, remember this, it is a political act done in pursuance of a treaty or an arrangement ad hoc. So be very clear, if let us suppose there is not a reciprocal arrangement between the governments of those two states, then the person may not be extradited. Alright. In CRPC, the reciprocal arrangement has been given under section 105 of the CRPC and section 105A to section 105L. So be very particular that what are the reciprocal arrangements. These are in pursuance of international treaties. These are not an obligation on them. If let us suppose we are trying to get Vijay Mallya and this guy Sushil Modi and several others extradited from United Kingdom. In this situation, always remember this, that those courts may refuse. So regarding Vijay Mallya, they have approved and he is now preferring his appeal, I think, in your United Kingdom Supreme Court. But extradition can be refused if at all it violates the principles of extradition of that particular state where a government seeks a particular person to be extradited. तो अगर जैसे अगर इंडिया चाहती है कि विजय माल्या का एक्स्ट्राडिशन हो, तो इंडिया को यूके की एक्स्ट्राडिशन एक्ट पे खरा उतरना होगा. अगर वो नहीं उतर पाती है तो वो नहीं सक्सीड कर पाएगी एक्स्ट्राडिशन में, बिकॉज देयर आर प्रिंसिपल्स वो जो ट्रीटी में होते हैं कि ह्यूमन राइट्स का वायलेशन नहीं होगा, फेयर ट्रायल होगा, ये सारी चीज़ें होंगी. अगर मान लीजिए यूके की कोर्ट को लग गया कि फेयर ट्रायल नहीं होगा अगर उसको इंडिया में एक्स्ट्राडाइट कर दिया, या उसका पॉलिटिकल ऑपरेशन होगा, या ही माइट बी लिंच्ड टू डेथ, इन दो सिचुएशंस इट मे रिफ्यूज. ये मैं एज एन एग्जांपल दे रहा हूँ, हालांकि ये सारा उनका अप्रूव हो गया है, लेकिन ये मैं आपको समझाने के लिए बता रहा हूँ कि एक्स्ट्राडिशन प्रोसीजर बड़ा इजी नहीं होता है, ये बहुत टफ होता है. दैट इज़ वाई पीपल रन अवे टू डिफरेंट कंट्रीज. और अगर आपके डिप्लोमेटिक रिलेशन सही हैं, आपके पॉलिटिकल रिलेशन सही हैं, तो इन दो सिचुएशंस यू ऑलवेज सक्सीड इन गेटिंग अ पर्सन एक्स्ट्राडिटेड. सो ऑलवेज रिमेंबर कि ये सारे प्रोसीजर्स, ये सारी चीज़ें जो होती हैं पॉलिटिकल एक्ट के परसुएंस में होती हैं, और ट्रीटी और एन अरेंजमेंट एड हॉक. एड हॉक इज अ टेम्परेरी अरेंजमेंट फॉर एक्स्ट्राडिशन. So, continuing with the case of State of West Bengal versus Jugal Kishore Moore, it is founded on a broad principle that it is in the interest of a civilized community that crime should not go unpunished, and on that account it is recognized as a part of comity of nations that one state should ordinarily afford to another state assistance towards bringing the offenders to justice. The law relating to extradition between the independent states is based on treaties, but the law has operation national as well as international. It governs the international relationship between the sovereign state, which is secured by treaty obligation. If there are no treaty obligations or no reciprocal arrangements, then the extradition will not succeed. But whether an offender should be handed over pursuant to a requisition is determined by the domestic law of the state on which the requisition is made. See, I just told you this before. Though extradition is granted in implementation of international commitments of the state, the procedure to be followed by the courts in deciding whether the extradition should be granted and on what terms is determined by the municipal law. Always remember, it is the court who will determine whether it is a fit case for extradition or not, in UK also and everywhere else. You make a request to the political entity, that is, if India has to get a certain person from UK extradited, it will make a request to the United Kingdom's government. United Kingdom's government will then institute a case before the appropriate tribunal or the court which deals with the issues of extradition. Now there the case will be tried, and if the case is found to be fit for extradition, then only it will be approved. Alright, it has a very elaborate procedure, but that is not at all necessary for the purpose of your exam. But if you intend to practice in the on the extradition or immigration side, then you should know about it. Now I come to chapter number 2. That is about general explanations. Definition is in this code to be understood to subject to exceptions. So, when the IPC, I'll just tell you in a very simplified manner. When the IPC is talking about certain offences, let us suppose murder, and even though it has not talked about general exceptions there, you will still read it in accordance as if there was an implied condition of general exceptions were it to be found. Alright. See, the murder will not, while describing murder, the IPC will not expressly talk about whether the murder has been committed in a state of accident or has been exercised in the right of private defense, then you will not be liable for murder or several other things. The IPC under section 6 is always saying that whenever you read a definition of an offence, whenever, be it robbery, dacoity, theft, your murder, hurt, grievous hurt, whatever, you will understand it subject to the exceptions contained in chapter entitled General Exceptions, even though they are not repeated in those penal provisions. Alright. So you will read it subject to those general exceptions. Now illustration has been given. The section in this code which contains definition of offences do not express that a child under 7 years of age cannot commit an offence, but the definition are to be understood subject to the general exception which provides that nothing shall be an offence which is done by a child under 7 years of age. You know, a child under 7 years of age is duly incapax. Now we come to illustration B, which says a police officer without warrant apprehends Z, who has committed murder. Here is not guilty of an offence of wrongful confinement, for he was bound by law to apprehend Z, and therefore the case falls within the general exception which provides that nothing is an offence when which is done by a person who is bound by law to do it. If let us suppose a police officer were to apprehend a particular person, and that person dies due to a heart attack because he believes that now the police officer will confine him and he'll be tried, and due to his blood pressure and several other ailments he suffers a heart attack and dies. You cannot institute a prosecution or succeed in a prosecution. You can always institute a prosecution, but you will not succeed in it, because the police officer was acting under his duty as he was bound by law to apprehend such persons who has committed a particular offence and a cognizable offence. In order to know who such under what circumstances a police officer can arrest without warrant, you may refer to section 41 of the CRPC if you are so interested. Now we come to section 8, which talks about the gender. The pronoun he and its derivatives are used of any person, whether male or female. Alright. So if the IPC were to incorporate expression he it would include she in it, unless the context is otherwise. Alright, like the offenses against women can only be committed by a man. It is not gender neutral, but murder is gender neutral, even though it has been spoken of as if in the sense of a person who is male. Now we come to section 9. Unless the contrary appears from the context, words importing a singular number including a plural number and words importing the plural number include a singular number. So unless the IPC is specific about a certain number, till then you will assume that the word singular will include plural. But in what situations IPC is certain about certain numbers? Let us suppose Dakati is being talked about, or an unlawful assembly is being talked about. Then there is a requirement of 5 or more persons. Now there IPC is very specific. Now there the number 5 or more has to be there. But let us suppose an offense is not being described in a particularly wide sense. Then you will always assume that plural number is also there in singular number. Furthermore, we continue with man and woman. The word man denotes a male human being of any age. The word woman denotes a female human being of any age. Now we come to the word person. I dealt with this yesterday. It includes any company or association or body of persons, whether incorporated or not. What is the meaning of inclusive definition? It means there is something more, and it has to be construed as justum generis. The legislature does not intend to codify the entire definition. It is giving an illustrative definition. By the usage of words inclusive, we can gather that. Now we come to the definition of public. It includes any class of public or any community. Alright. Now we come to the important terms of judge. Now the word judge denotes not only a person who is officially designated as a judge, but also denotes every person who is empowered by law in any legal proceedings, civil, criminal, a definitive judgment, or a judgment which if not appealed against would be definitive, or a judgment which if confirmed by some authority would be definitive, or who is one of the body of person which a body of person is empowered by law to give the judgment. Now let me tell you that if a magistrate tries a case which is empowered to try and sentence while reading your first schedule of the CRPC, then in those situations the magistrate is a judge. Let us suppose a magistrate is trying a case of theft. He tries it and sentences the person. Here the magistrate is the judge. But in a murder case, if the magistrate is merely committing the case to the sessions court, he is not a judge in this situation. Alright, during the committal proceedings, the magistrate does not act as a judge. Be very particular about that. District magistrate is not a judge. Be very clear about that. Being a judge affords you a certain protection. Under Judicial Officers Protection Act, an FIR cannot be instituted against you without the sanctions of the Chief Justice of the High Court if you are a subordinate court, and if you are a High Court judge, then without the consent of the Chief Justice of India, an FIR cannot be filed against you. The judgments regarding that are many. For the subordinate judges, it is UP Judicial Officers Association versus Union of India. That is not important for the purpose of exam. That is only academic in nature. I am just telling you through my own 2 cents. Study notes will not at all include all of this, because it is irrelevant from the point of view of the exam, and also from the point of view of the IPC, because you are now going into the domains of other laws. And for the High Court judge, there is a judgment of K. Veeraswamy versus Union of India, where it was held that the judges are also public servant, and there is a requirement that if an FIR has to be filed against a particular judge, you need to take the sanction of the Chief Justice of India, who will give his opinion, and the President of India shall act in accordance with that opinion. Then second is Judicial Officer Protection Act. A civil proceedings cannot be used against you. Then there is a Judges Protection Act. For your judgment, neither a civil neither a criminal proceeding can be instituted against you. Then there is section 77 of the IPC, that nothing is an offense which is done by a judge while acting judicially. Now, you see that the powers of the judges are very vast, and the defenses of the judges are very vast as compared to any other public servant. Now, there is also a requirement of sanction under 197. Now, for institution of the case also there is a requirement of sanction. Now, for prosecution's cognizance, in order to take cognizance also there is a requirement of sanction. And there is a dual requirement of sanction for the judges. One is from the side of the executive and one is from the side of the Chief Justice. Alright, if you were to prosecute a judge in Delhi, there was this case where the state government said that this is a fit case for prosecution, but the Chief Justice disagreed. Chief Justice said this is not a fit case for prosecution, and the matter ended at that. Alright, so the procedural requirements are there, and the prosecution of judges is very tough. Even the procedure to complain against the judge is very tough. You have to give it on affidavit, and let us suppose you are unable to prove your allegations, you yourself can be sentenced for 7 years in contempt of court. If it is found that your case scandalizes a judge and you are unable to prove your case, you might be sentenced also for giving false evidence and for contempt of court. This can also happen. There are many other nuances there. So, know that the position of judge is very high, and also know that there is a difference between an IAS and an administrative executive and a judge. A judge exercises a sovereign judicial power of the state. The power is sovereign in nature, like legislative and executive. In the case of All India Judges Association versus Union of India, 1993, there was a review petition where the Supreme Court clarified that the judge exercises a sovereign function and the parity of judges is with the political executive. Your ministers and governors and the members of the legislative assembly and the parliament. The parity of the status is not between the administrative executive and your judicial officer. The administrative executive is akin to the servants of the political executive. The true sovereign power is being exercised by the political executive such as chief ministers and the ministers concerned. The administrative executive like IAS and all that only assist in implementation of the decisions of these people. Similarly, the judges also exercise the sovereign judicial power of the state. The power is sovereign in nature. When we say there are three sovereign powers of a state: executive, judiciary, and your legislative. So the judge of a subordinate court, even the most inferior judge, the most inferior of all, second class judicial magistrate, while he is giving a judgment, he is exercising the sovereign judicial power of the state. Be very particular about that. He is not acting on behalf of the powers granted to him by the Chief Justice of India. The powers inhere within the court due to the virtue that it is a court, and the court exercises its sovereign power because that sovereign power inheres within the state itself. Alright. So this is why even the chapter of subordinate judiciary was incorporated in the constitution itself. In this case, All India Judges Association versus Union of India was regarding the salary matters, and the salary of a judge is substantially more than that of an IAS, because the central government and the state government wanted to give them a salary of an IAS, but the judges disagreed and said this was regarding subordinate court judges, your district judiciary. The Supreme Court and the High Court were already drawing salary much more than that of any IAS, but and coupled with the allowance, they get a lot more. But your subordinate court judiciary were getting a salary equivalent that of an IAS, so that was problematic for them. The Supreme Court categorically said that there can be no parity of status between them. The judges exercise a sovereign function of a subordinate court, and the parity of status is between them and political executive. Alright, so that is why you see the basic pay and certain other allowances are different. Now, right now, you are in the course of third National Judicial Pay Commission, I think, and its report is being awaited. So I digress. We come to the point of Court of Justice. The words Court of Justice denote a judge who is empowered by law to act judicially alone, or a body of judges which is empowered by law to act judicially as a body, when such judge or body of judges is acting judicially. So a panchayat acting under Regulation 7 of 1816 of Madras Code, having power to try and determine the suit, is Court of Justice. Very self-explanatory provision. You will not most probably get a question regarding this, but you might get a question regarding who is a judge. Alright. So keep in mind that the protection of the judges will not extend to the executive magistrates. The protection of the judges are for the judicial officers alone, and only the judicial officers are protected under those provisions. Alright. So now I come to the issue of public servant, and that is the most contentious issue. There is no such thing as a public representative alone. All members of parliament also are public servants as well. Often what happened in one case I heard, there was a certain gentleman, Mr. Sitaram Yechuri. He said that I am not a public servant, I am a public representative. For there he would be wrong, because members of parliament under P.V. Narasimha, in the case of P.V. Narasimha Rao versus state, have been held to be your public servants. So I'll be reading this clause. The words public servant denote a person falling under any other description hereinafter following, namely, first, it has been repeated. Second, every commissioned officer in military, naval or air force of India. Third is every judge, including any person empowered by law to act or discharge, whether by himself or a member of body or person. So you need to focus on the first primary words. Judge is included. Fourth is every officer of the Court of Justice. He is included within that. Fifth is every juryman, assessor or member of a panchayat assisting the court, or a public servant. He is within that. Sixth is every arbitrator or other person whom any cause or matter has been referred to for the decision or report by any court of justice or by other competent authority. He is also within that definition. Seventh is every person who holds any office by the virtue of which he is empowered to place or keep any person in confinement. So a jailer is a public servant, superintendent of jail is a public servant. Every officer of the government whose duty is as such officer to prevent offences or to give information of offences, to bring offenders to justice or to protect public health, safety or convenience. So your police officers, your custom officers, your food inspectors are all covered under that. Alright, health inspector, etc. I am just giving an illustration. The ninth is every officer whose duty it is as such officer to take, receive, keep or expend any property on behalf of the government, or make any survey, assessment or contract on behalf of the government. So your CPWD engineers, or let us suppose government appoints an architect for a particular person, for a particular project. If the government were to appoint an architect for a particular project and engineers for a particular project, they would be covered under this definition as public servants. And government also have a permanent department of their government engineers and government architects. For example, in Delhi you have CPWD, and they are covered under this 9th clause. Alright, so it is very wide. It says to make any survey, assessment or contract on behalf of the government, or to execute any revenue process, or to instigate or to investigate or to report any matter affecting pecuniary interest of the government, tax officials, or to make, authenticate or keep any document relating to the pecuniary interest of the government, your government's accountant. Alright, or to prevent any infraction of any law for protection of pecuniary interest of the government. Your excise officers, your tax officials, your assessors, engineers. 9th clause is also very widely worded, so they will be covered under that. 10th is every officer whose duty it is as such officer to take, receive, keep or expend any property, or to make any survey or assessment, or to levy any rate or tax for any secular common purpose of any village, town, district, or make, authenticate, or keep any document for ascertaining the rights of a people of any village, town, or district. Your BDOs are covered under this, block development officers. 11th is every person who holds an office in virtue of which he is empowered to prepare, publish, maintain, or revise an electoral roll or conduct an election or part of an election. Then we come to 12th point. I think 11th should be very self-explanatory for you all. 12th is every person in service or pay of the government or remunerated by fees or commission for the performance of any public duty. B. In service of any local authority or corporation established under Central, Provincial or State Act or a government company as defined under Section 670 of the Companies Act 1956. This has been repealed and now you have Companies Act 2013. So a municipal commissioner is a public servant. Alright. And also you need to know if a person has been appointed by the government and he is performing public functions, he is called a public servant generally, unless on the matters of fact it has been shown that the person, even though is appointed by the government, does not perform public functions. Alright, so there is a lot of nuance in that, and it is primarily concerned with the cases of Prevention of Corruption Act. Since I am not dealing with the lecture of Prevention of Corruption Act, I will not elaborate a lot upon it because it might have the effect of confusing you all. But for the purpose of IPC it's very simple, but for the purpose of Prevention of Corruption Act it is very complex. So if you intend to practice in Prevention of Corruption Act, you need to know the definition of public servant in very great detail. So explanation 1. Persons falling under the above description are public servant whether appointed by the government or not. Alright, so for the purpose of IPC it's very straightforward. Your public servant will fall within that definition, even if let us suppose the court were to appoint you that, or a competent authority empowered by government were to appoint you for the performance of particular public duties, you will be a public servant for that purpose. It is construed in the matters of law that since the power of appointment has been delegated by the, let us suppose your government itself to a particular competent authority, then it is the government itself who is appointing you. See, what will be construed as the government appointing you? If let us suppose you were to be appointed by state government, then the order has to come by the governor itself. Alright. But let us suppose if an IG were to appoint a sub-inspector, the IG always writes that he acts on the behalf of governor. Then one person can take an objection that he has been actually in such inspector has de facto been appointed by IG, not by government itself, not by the government itself, because even though the IG acts on behalf of the governor, it is not the governor himself who has given the order. So the explanation 1 cures that defect. It says that if you fall within this definition, you are a public servant. Whether the government directly appoints you or not, it is irrelevant. You perform a public duty, you fall within these 12 clauses, you are a public servant. Explanation 2 says, wherever the words public servant occur, they shall be understood of every person who is in actual possession of the situation of a public servant, whatever legal defect there may be in his right to hold that situation. Now let us suppose a person becomes a particular officer in a government. Let us suppose he became a PCS officer, an SDM, and in order to become that PCS officer, he forged a fake caste certificate. He pretended to be belonging to an ST community or SC community, but he belonged to what? He belonged to your general community. In those situations, if this person were acting as a public servant for, let us suppose, 5 years, and later his fraud is known, and 2 cases are instituted against him, one under Prevention of Corruption Act, other under your forgery and defrauding the government, etc., etc. So for that purpose, this public servant, even though he had a defect in his appointment, he shouldn't be appointed in the first place because he played fraud upon the government, but he'll still be prosecuted, and the prosecution will succeed if the prosecution is able to prove that throughout his tenure of even of defective appointment, he indulged into corruption, and he'll be punished. No matter if later it comes to know that he shouldn't have been appointed as a public servant in the first place because there was a legal defect in his appointment. Alright, so the prevention of corruption prosecution will succeed if this fake person were to indulge into corruption even though there was a legal defect in his appointment. So you see, the legislature always thinks about these events also, that if we give a very tight definition here, it might have its ripple effect in some other act. So the legislature always thinks about all these situations before coming to this conclusion. That is why when a law is drafted, it has to be drafted intelligibly. Alright, it cannot be drafted on whims or fancy or assumptions. So the law is a very complex subject, and the law always has its connection with the other statutes. Rarely you will find an act which is self-contained. Companies Act, let us suppose you are talking about Companies Act. A company acts certain actions under Companies Act can carry forward into IPC. They can go into CRPC by construction then. Now Companies Act matter can also go into insolvency and bankruptcy code, and that insolvency and bankruptcy code can also go into your NCLT rules. So the law is always working like this. The law works by interlinkation. The law is not a straight line, and the law is not a compartment. The law is like a web, and it is the best definition of law. The law is like a web. It interconnects, that every joint is connected to everything else. That is how the law works. So while you are looking at the explanation 1 and explanation 2 and the explanation of public servant, the legislature in its wisdom has also thought about the Prevention of Corruption Act. That is why the definition has been worded like this. Alright. So always keep your mind open regarding interlinkation. Of course, from the point of view of the exam, the only interlinkation that you need to do is regarding IPC, CRPC and evidence, as far as the criminal law is concerned. Nothing beyond that. For CPC, it is straightforward. If you can interlink at best with the Constitution, that is very good. While I was explaining CRPC, I was interlinking it with the Constitution as well, so that you also have an holistic interpretation of a particular law, and you inculcate this habit within yourself also for interlinkation. And it is an art. It is a skill which is developed slowly by practice. Nobody is born with it. Now I come to the explanation number 3. The word election denotes election for the purpose of selecting members of any legislative, municipal or any public authority of whatever character. The method of selection to which is by under any law prescribed by election. So that is also self-explanatory, be it your municipal elections, be it your state elections, be it your central elections. So it is an all-exclusive definition regarding that. Alright. So we are primarily concerned with that. So I'll give you a small test. The test to determine whether a person is a public servant is twofold. Whether he is in the service of pay of the government, first. Second, whether he is entrusted with the performance of any public duty. Alright. So these are the twin tests of public servant. The definition, of course, is not exhaustive. Under section 21, the definition is not intended to be exhaustive at all. It is only illustrative. So that is why there are twin tests. And see, since from the point of view of the exams, this is not essential. That is why if you actually want to know this, note it down in your lecture register. I always tell you to maintain 2 registers. One is note, another is lecture. I will not be giving you the notes of this point because I will be narrating that. This is regarding different domains of law. So that is why you need to maintain a lecture register as well. And if you think this information is necessary for you, you note it down. If you do not think this information is necessary for you, do not note it down. But the test for a public servant is, always remember, it is twofold. First is whether he is in a service or pay of the government. and second, whether he is interested with the performance of the public duty or not. Alright, this is twofold, and of course, under Prevention of Corruption Act, there are several other circumstances that are there. I already told you that High Court and Supreme Court judges also come within the definition of a judge, and that has been held in K. Veerasamy versus Union of India. Now I'll give you a list. Note this down in your lecture register. That following persons has been held to be a public servant. First is member of a parliament. Second is chief minister and ministers, judges of the superior courts, High Court and Supreme Court, speaker of the Legislative Assembly, employees of a nationalized bank, all railway servants, teachers in government school, chairman of managing committee of a municipality, employees of Life Insurance Corporation, member of Auxiliary Air Force, employee of Bharat Heavy Electrical India Limited, employees of government company, officers of State Electricity Board, an employee of cooperative society which is controlled or rated by the government is also a public servant under section 2C of the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988. Secretary, health supervisor of municipality, drug inspector, any surveyor while performing his legitimate function under any revenue civil court, sometimes the collectors and all that, collectors and your assistant collector sends a surveyor in order to determine the area of land revenue, the area that will be subject to land revenue, and for that purpose they always send a surveyor. That person has also been held as a public servant. Your government pleaders are also public servant. An IAS officer who is posted as a managing director of State Financial Corporation, he is also a public servant. The Sarpanch of Gram Panchayat is also a public servant. Alright, you should maintain this list in your lecture register. Now, keep one thing in mind and keep one thing very clear. What I have told you, this list, is regarding the Prevention of Corruption Act, because all these persons I mentioned, in one way or the other, have been prosecuted under those acts. Alright, that is why I told you a list. This is not from IPC, but the issues of IPC always comes in the domain of Prevention of Corruption Act 1988. Now I'll tell you persons who are not public servants. Alright, now maintain a separate list. University examiner is not a public servant. Elected office bearers within president and secretary of a registered cooperative society are not public servant. A chartered accountant who has been appointed as an investigator by central government under Insurance Act 1938 is not a public servant. This was held in the case of Ramakrishna Dalmia versus Delhi administration. The citation is AIR 1962 Supreme Court page number 1821. A laboratory officer in municipal corporation is also not a public servant. A member of an IAS whose service is placed at the disposal of a cooperative society during that tenure is not a public servant. Alright. This was held in SS Dhanova versus Municipal Corporation, AIR 1981 Supreme Court page number 1395. Section, I think this will be a 10th person who is not a public servant. A chairperson and standing committee chairman of municipality is also not a public servant. Leader of opposition is also not a public servant. That has been held in Sushil Modi versus Mohan Guru Swami. That was a judgment of Delhi High Court. It was reported in 2008 Criminal Law Journal page number 541. A hospital or authorization committee constituted by government under section 9 subsection 4 of Transplantation of Human Organs Act 1994 is also not a public servant. Okay? Authorization committee is not a public servant if it's acting under section 9 clause 4 of the Transplantation of Human Organs Act. I'm actually giving you this list because I'm actually covering all those areas where I hold the knowledge of a particular subject, and I thought that it will suit your holistic interest to know the issues regarding what are public servant and what are not. But it is only necessary if you want to know that. If you do not wish to know all of this, if you only want to know about IPC, then just know about the particular definition of IPC and move away from it. Another is branch manager under Assam State Warehousing Corporation has been held not to be a public servant. Alright, be very particular about the institutions and the positions I am mentioning, because these have been gathered from numerous case laws. A commissioner appointed by a civil court to seize an account book is not a public servant. Alright. And 15th is a panel of doctor under ESI scheme has again not been held to be a public servant. That was under the case of state of Maharashtra versus Dr. Rustam Franrose Hakim. It was decided by Bombay High Court and reported in year 2000 Criminal Law Journal, page number 3401. So why did I give you such an elaborate list as to who have been held to be a public servant and who have not been held to be a public servant? And you have to note it down in your lecture register if you wish. The reason was, I wanted to explain to you that I took you to Prevention of Corruption Act, I took you to the Cooperative Societies Act, Human Transplantation of Organs Act, and several other acts in order to show you and to demonstrate to you that often it has happened that this issue regarding public servant has cropped up in these many acts. Alright, so the issue is not just confined to IPC, it goes around in many other acts, and it has its own nuances, fact and circumstances, etc. That is why I gave you an elaborated list to just open your mind regarding this aspects of public servant. That do not think that this definition is all inclusive and it's exhaustive in nature and nothing beyond is there, and it is only confined to IPC. It goes beyond that. So I think we can complete one more section and my time will be over after that. So movable property. What is a movable property? Movable property are intended to include corporeal property. What is a corporeal property? It is a property you can touch and feel. It is palpable in nature. Of every description except land and things attached to the earth, or permanently fastened to anything which is attached to the earth. Alright. So I think it is very self-explanatory, but I'll give you an illustration. A laptop is a movable property, but a house is not an movable property, because even though it is palpable in nature, it cannot be moved from one place to another, at least not easily. Your table is a movable property. Your tree, if let us suppose, if the intention is that the tree should be there in perpetuity and you are only there to extract fruits of the trees, let us suppose it is a mango tree, you do not intend it to be cut down ever, then in that case tree will also be construed as immovable property, not movable property. But if let us suppose the tree is cut and then stolen, now that has become movable property. Alright. So the term movable property will apply on anything which is palpable and can be moved from one place to another. Alright. So look at everything around you. Your books are movable property, your laptops are movable property, your mobile phones are movable property. They are subject to theft and they are subject to criminal breach of trust. This is why these definitions of movable property and wrongful gain, wrongful loss, dishonestly, fraudulently, they require a holistic understanding so that you can know that what makes a particular act an offense and what not. There are sometimes some sort of property which are impalpable in nature, which you cannot touch and feel. What are those properties? Let us suppose I give you an authorization of trademark or a copyright. If I grant it to you, if you have a copyright rights, if you have patent rights, those are also properties, but those are not palpable in nature. Hence, they have another term for them. They are called intellectual properties. Alright. They are impalpable in nature. You cannot touch or feel them. So, always remember this, the section that has been given under section, the definition that has been given under section 22 will not exempt earth and things attached to the earth, but land and things attached to the earth are only exempted. Let us suppose if a particular lake has rich reserves of salt and a person were to go there and steal some of the salt from that lake, then he'll be subject to theft. All right. Now one cannot take this defense that the lake is an immovable property and hence I stole something from that, then it should be construed as not a movable property and hence by that construction it shouldn't be subject to theft. That definition will not succeed. That contention will not succeed at all. All right. So soil, its components and the part of soil, stones, minerals, when they are severed from earth or land to which they are attached, becomes movable property and become capable of being subject of theft. All right. I'll reiterate. Let us suppose there is a gold mine. And that is under the ownership of government. You were to go and you were to infiltrate that gold mine and then steal some gold, or to steal some diamonds from a diamond mine or a mineral mine, whatever the case may be. Then you will be charged for theft in those situations, even though you have stolen something from a place which by itself is immovable in nature. But the moment you sever something movable from something which is immovable, that property will become what? That property will become movable property. The moment you sever something from immovable property like soil, minerals, clay, gold, etc., rubies, gems, etc., from anything which is under the ownership of a particular person, even though while they were attached to that immovable property, they were themselves immovable property. But since you have severed them, since you have severed their connection, उनको अलग कर दिया है आपने, so in those situations, what will be it construed? That will be construed, that soil that you have severed, that salt you have stolen, the minerals that you have taken, the diamonds that you have taken, the gold that you have taken from that gold mines or particular mineral mines or gem mines, whatever, that will be considered as movable property, even though mine itself is not movable. Alright, so get this difference. So any part of the earth, whether it be stone, sand or clay or any other component, when it is severed from the earth, is movable property. Alright. Standing crop, so long as it is attached to the earth, is not movable property, right? आप खेत में जाइए, जब तक वो जड़ा हुआ है तब तक वो immovable property का पार्ट माना जाता है. But the moment you sever it from the earth, it becomes movable property and it becomes subject to theft. ये सारी चीजें ध्यान में रखिएगा. अब wrongful gain और fraudulently और dishonestly तो मैंने आपको ऑलरेडी बता ही दिया है. तो एक सेक्शन में और डील कर लेता हूं, सेक्शन 26. रीजन टू बिलीव. A person is said to have reason to believe a thing if he has sufficient cause to believe that thing but not otherwise. So, reason to believe, ध्यान रखिएगा, is not synonymous with suspicion or doubt. It is a probable reasoning which is based on facts. Alright, facts पे बेस होता है reason to believe, क्योंकि वो reason है, वो suspicion नहीं है. Suspicion can arise even without any reason. But a reason is always based on definitive facts. So be very sure when the statute uses the word reason to believe, then the sufficient cause to that belief has to be based on sufficient facts, not on your inferences or suspicions which are not backed up by any facts at all. Alright? It is what the word believe, the word reason to believe is very much stronger than the word suspect, and it involves the necessity of showing that the circumstances were such that a reasonable man must have felt convinced in his mind that the note, that the particular fact which he is dealing with leads to a particular conclusion, that let us suppose he believes a particular note is forged, right? Then he has to first compare that forged note with a real note, or give it to some expert who has the capacity to compare. And when he certifies that this is a forged note, then on that fact it can be said that the person has a reason to believe that the note is forged. Alright, this is how you construe reason to believe. It is a belief which is based on fact. It is not synonymous with the word suspicion or doubt. Alright. And then we come to section 27. This is the last section that I'll deal with for today's lecture. From tomorrow we'll start with section 34. It says, section 27, property in possession of wife, clerk or servant. And the property in possession of a wife, clerk or servant on account of that person, it is in that person's possession within the meaning of this code. A person employed temporarily or in a particular occasion in a capacity of a clerk or servant is a clerk or servant within the meaning of this section. You need to always keep in mind section 27. You will always read it with the definition of theft and definition of criminal misappropriation and criminal breach of trust. Be very sure of that. This section, what it has done, it has abrogated distinction made by English law between the word possession and custody. In Indian law, the possession and custody are not distinguished much. This has been noticed by the Supreme Court in the case of Jyoti Prasad versus State of Haryana, AIR 1993, Supreme Court, page number 1167, where the Supreme Court found, after considering several other things, that the distinction is not there between the possession and custody under Indian law. Another case that I might tell you regarding that was held in Fateh Chand Agarwal. It was decided by Calcutta High Court in 1916. It was reported in 1916, volume number 44, Calcutta Reporter, page number 477, Federal Bench. So under section 27, a person, the person who has been employed as a clerk or servant, or a person who is a wife of a particular person, if he or she were to possess a particular thing, they were to be treated as what? They will be treated as in those situations, a person who is possessing that thing will be treated as that they are having possession on behalf of that person. So hence, the person who has employed such clerk or servant, or if the wife of that person holds a particular thing, it will always be construed that it is in the constructive possession of that particular person. Alright. So remember, in India, if a person, if the possession has been held by a clerk or servant of a particular person or the wife of that particular person, it will always be construed that it is in the possession of that person. Alright, who is the owner of that thing? If the owner of the person grants the possession to his wife or clerk or servant of a particular article or a particular good or a particular amount of money, then it will always be presumed that it is only in the possession of the original owner, and it is the legal fiction by the usage of constructive possession. In English law, this used to be called custody. In English law, what happened was that when the property was not in the possession of the original possessor or the original owner, and if it was in the possession of a servant or clerk, the English law used the term custody. But the Indian law has abrogated the distinction between the possession and custody. Alright. In Indian law, you'll still call it possession, if at all the article has been possessed by the clerk, servant or wife of that particular person. Alright. In some cases, see, I'll tell you one thing, that a permanent mistress has been regarded as wife in some cases, but do not rely on that. There was only one isolated, there were only two isolated cases regarding this. One was Narendranath Majumdar versus State, that was in Calcutta High Court, reported, that was a case of Calcutta High Court, and other was Dharam Singh versus State, it was by Punjab and Haryana High Court, where such kinds of constructions were made. But I will always tell you not to rely on such type of isolated cases, because they do not clear the position of law. So generally mistress is construed as something other than a wife. A mistress is not treated as a wife generally. Let us suppose a man has a wife, he is a Hindu man, he is not at all authorized to have a second wife, and if he were to make a mistress, then in those situations the mistress will not be synonymous with the term wife. Alright, so the mistress, if the article is in the possession of a mistress, then that cannot be called as in the custody of wife under section 20 for the purpose of section 27. Alright, but there are some judgments who have held that a permanent mistress can be treated as wife. So that is due to judicial fiction in peculiar facts of the case. Know this, these judgments were given in peculiar facts of the case, but I will always advise you not to rely on them. Alright, so the word wife and mistress are not synonymous, they are very different terms. But due to facts and due to long duration and long cohabitation, in the given facts of the case I just mentioned, where the permanent mistress has been treated as a wife, the court actually thought that we can actually extend this construction to the mistress as well. These judgments are not fit for reliance, but only for your academic value I am telling you that these sorts of judgments are also there. You will always find judgments which struck a different chord and go against the mainstream judgments. Do not rely on them generally. Alright, unless it has been held by a larger bench, and these are the judgments which have been held by the high courts, and they are isolated cases often held by a single judge benches. So I never rely on them. So that was it. Primary thing you need to focus in IPC is in regards to section 27, when the property is in possession of a person's wife, clerk or servant, it will be presumed that it is in the possession of that person only, who is the owner or the true possessor. The section, and you need to remember the principle. See, you need not remember the case law. You need to only remember the principle. The principle is the section that under Indian law, the distinction between the English law of the terms between custody and possession has been changed. Alright. In English law, if the goods were in the possession of wife, clerk or servant, the English law will use the term custody, not the word possession. But under Indian law, for these three people, wife, clerk and servant, they are to be treated as possession itself. Alright, for these three people, the distinction between custody and possession has been abrogated. So that was it for today's lecture. We'll meet tomorrow on section 34 of the IPC and deal with some allied matters.